So, today we're going to do a deep dive into Donald Trump's 2016 domestic policy platform. We'll start with the actual promises he made on the campaign trail, and then we'll dig into a really interesting post-election analysis that tries to explain the social and economic forces that, well, fueled his rise.
All right, let's just transport ourselves back for a second. This is the 2016 campaign trail, a moment that, completely reshaped the American political landscape. And it was on stages just like this one that a set of really bold policy promises were first introduced to voters.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the campaign's big vision for America. That includes its economic promises and its stance on the Second Amendment. Then we're going to pivot and jump into a critical perspective from the Foreign Policy Journal to try and understand the uprising that brought this whole platform right to the forefront.
Every political platform really has to start with a big picture vision, right? For the Trump campaign, their tax reform plan was built around 4 really simple but powerful goals for the country.
So, the campaign's whole economic vision was built on these 4 key pillars, and they spoke directly to some very common frustrations. We're talking tax relief for the middle class, a simpler tax code for everybody, a promise of major economic growth, and of course a commitment to being fiscally responsible.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. The absolute centerpiece of the domestic agenda was a pretty radical overhaul of the U.S. tax code for both businesses and for individuals.
This one's super simple. And really, that was the whole point. A single 15% flat tax was proposed for all businesses. We're talking from huge Fortune 500 companies all the way down to mom-and-pop shops and even freelancers. The goal here was to make the U.S. corporate tax rate one of the most competitive in the world.
Now, for individuals, the plan was all about simplifying the tax code by slashing the 7 existing tax brackets down to just 4. This included a huge zero tax bracket for anyone earning under $25,000 or $50,000 for married couples, with the rates going up from there for higher incomes.
But it didn't stop with the new tax brackets. The plan also called for getting rid of the death tax completely, creating new deductions for childcare, and hitting corporate cash that's stashed overseas with a one-time 10% tax to bring it back home. And here's the real kicker. The campaign promised that with all these changes, nearly 75 million households would be taken off the income tax rolls altogether.
Okay, let's switch gears from money to another massive topic in the 2016 platform, a really strong defense of Second Amendment rights. The campaign actually laid out its position in a pretty detailed paper.
Wow. The language here is just incredibly direct. This is the opening line from the policy paper, and it leaves absolutely no room for interpretation. It frames the right to bear arms as a fundamental right for all law-abiding Americans, period, for self-defense.
So the plan itself was basically a 3-pronged approach. First, it called for cracking down and enforcing the gun laws we already have, using programs like Project Exile as a model. Second, it aimed to completely overhaul the nation's mental health system. And third, it wanted to expand the rights of gun owners with things like a national right to carry.
So we've seen the promises, right, on taxes and on gun rights, but honestly, that's only half the story. To really get why this platform worked, why it resonated, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
And to get that broader context, we're going to dive into this analysis from the Foreign Policy Journal. It was published right after the 2016 election, and it offers a really compelling explanation for why this message, this platform, hit home for so many voters.
So the core argument of this article is that the Trump phenomenon wasn't some sudden storm that came out of nowhere. No, it was more like a slow brewing hurricane, fueled by decades of economic neglect of the American working class by, and this is key, both Democrats and Republicans.
So what did that socioeconomic landscape actually look like on the ground? Well, the article uses some pretty powerful data and historical context to paint a picture of just how many people felt completely left behind.
To really understand the economic pressure people were feeling, just look at these numbers from 2014. Over a third of all American workers were making less than $20,000 a year. More than half were earning less than $30,000. This wasn't just a statistic, This was the daily reality of economic struggle for millions and millions of people.
And the analysis argues that this economic distress gave rise to 2 very different kinds of populism. On one side, you had what it calls left-wing populism, like the Sanders campaign, which pushed for universal social programs to help everyone. And on the other side, you had right-wing populism, which focused more on improving the lives of white workers, often by tapping into social and racial anxieties.
This wasn't some sudden shift. The article argues that the seeds for this populist uprising were planted way back in the 1970s, as the power of unions started to decline. Then, the 2008 Great Recession just poured gasoline on the fire, with millions losing their homes. And in the years after that, as manufacturing jobs vanished and the recovery just never seemed to reach a lot of communities, this deep-seated anger took root. It created the perfect conditions for a populist wave.
So here's the question we're left with. When you put the promise of tax cuts and gun rights right next to the reality of this deep-seated economic pain, what matters more? Is it the specific policies on the table, or is it the feeling that someone, anyone, is finally listening? It's a question that really cuts to the very core of what drives our political choices.